Greetings, thanks for joining us. I'm Ron Lichman for Hardfire. We're on location today at the Brooklyn Main Library at Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn, and I'm happy to be joined by Cameron Weber, professor of economics at St. John's University, a former State Department diplomat whose illustrious career you will find at CameronEconomics.com. Welcome, Cameron.
Thank you, Ron. Right. And I was also the chief of financial oversight after I left the Foreign Service. I then became the chief of financial oversight at the State Department, financial oversight and coordination. And you used to be you're the previous chair of the Brooklyn Libertarian Party, right?
Manhattan Libertarian
Party. The Manhattan Libertarian Party, which is the father of us all, or the mother of us all. I mean, Manhattan Libertarian Party's been around for how long?
Oh, long before my time, at least in the 1970s, I believe. It was founded, I believe, when the LPNY.
1971 or so.
Or so.
The Libertarian Party was 1971. And recently we've just become an official party in New York because we had more than 50,000 votes for governor.
We have reached the high water mark, or the minimum low water mark, to become a recognized party in the state of New York for the next 4-year cycle, where the New York Libertarian Party will have ballot access, along with those other household names that you might remember, except the Reform Party lost theirs.
Oh, okay.
This cycle. But we're not here to talk about it.
No, we're
here to
not.
Talk about world economics.
Yes, we are. Yeah. So, today we're going to talk about why it doesn't matter if the USA imports more than it exports, and we might disagree a little bit.
We may or may not.
Yeah.
Well, we'll probably have an exchange of views.
Right. So I'm gonna lay out some concepts, and then we'll take it from there.
And just for a definitional purpose, when you describe the U.S. imports more than exports,
right,
that the vernacular phrase for that is a trade deficit.
Yeah, trade deficit. So the whole idea behind the fact that a nation should export more than it imports comes from Keynesian economics. And so I'm going to draw mark the Keynesian economics, Keynesian equation. So this is the Keynesian equation, how you measure the macroeconomy. National income, or GDP, Y, is equal to a given year's expenditures on consumption, a given year's expenditures on government spending, a given year's investment, and then exports minus imports. So you'll see that according to this equation in mainstream Keynesian economic thought, it's better to export more than you import, right? That's a mathematical tautology. So it's seen that it's better to export than import. And now the problem with that is, and this is a beggar thy neighbor or race to the bottom concept, is that if every nation, say for example, devalues its currency, what this does is it creates a war for devaluing your currency, because if you devalue your currency, that means your goods and services are less expensive on the world market, right?
But that's not the only way to make your goods and services more competitive.
Oh, of course, that's not the only way.
You can be more efficient.
You can be more efficient and make a better product, and better quality. But Keynesian economics is not about efficiency or economic growth. It's just about this tautology of expenditures for a given year is equal to national income for a given year. So Keynesian economics can't explain efficiency or economic growth. It can only explain how you add up these aggregates. And it's seen better than to export more than you import. And in fact, prior to the Enlightenment and prior to Adam Smith, the whole idea behind it, and the divine right to rule of the crown and the church, the state and the church, was to export more than you import so that under the gold standard, so that a state was under the gold standard, your exports were paid for by gold inflows, and those gold inflows were used to fight religious and territorial wars. So the whole idea was to hold down the living standards of everyone in the country by exporting more than importing, and in order for the church and the crown, or the church and the state, to get gold in their coffers. And then, in fact, it was a capital crime to export gold. So this Keynesian idea is just mercantilism, or it's just neo-mercantilism, which was paid by Adam Smith in the Enlightenment, and which only came back during the Great Depression. The whole idea behind this idea that it's mainstream idea, which is trumped, trumpeted by Donald Trump, and by most politicians use this idea that it's better to export than import in order to protect their special interests from foreign competition. But do you understand all that?
Good so far.
So far, so good. All right. So now we'll look at international capital flows and what determines international capital flows. So what determines international capital flows when you're an entrepreneur looking around the world for the most solid, profitable investments? You seek the real rate of return. And the real rate of return is the nominal rate of return minus inflation. But in fact, it's expected inflation, because your investment decisions are future oriented. So you look at real rate of return. Let's say you have a bond. ABC Corporation has a bond that's 10-year bond that's denominated in dollars, and it's 5%. It pays 5%. So the nominal face value of the bond is 5%. Yet expected inflation is in the United States is 2%, so the real rate of return would be 3%, right? So let's say you have a bond that's denominated in 5%, and then the expected inflation in the United States is 2%. That means that your expected real rate of return would be 3%, right? Now, do you have a savings account?
Money market account.
Money, and what does the money market pay?
Very, very low.
Should we be generous and say 1%?
That would be generous.
Right. Minus 2%, which means that every day, day in, day out,
You're losing money.
you're losing money.
Losing purchasing power.
Losing purchasing power. So the whole idea then is that relative rates of inflation determine international capital flows based on a bond that's issued in the secondary market. So in Europe right now, they actually have negative rates of interest due to their quantitative easing and monetary easing. So they're actually losing more than the 1% that the dollar loses, which is why the dollar is appreciating against the European currency now, because inflation is higher and they actually have negative interest rates policy. You got that? And then you could also I'd also like to subtract regime uncertainty. Another thing that you look at in international capital flows when you're an entrepreneur seeking investment returns is regime uncertainty. In other words, real rate of interest is equal to the nominal rate of interest return minus expected inflation minus regime uncertainty. And regime uncertainty is how uncertain is the rule of law. How often are tax regimes changed? how often our trade policies change, how often, how likely is the government to take over your assets,
Or
right?
the extreme whether the default of the bonds.
Or whether they're default on your bonds,
And the
which is,
question becomes
yeah,
return of capital more than even return on capital.
exactly, yeah, whether or not there'll be bond defaults is a big question, but, or if the Congress people don't raise the debt ceiling, and then you would default on the bonds.
Or when there was talk of doing that, yes.
Yeah, but I think,
Bond rates spiked.
yeah, but politicians like to keep their power, and so they're not gonna default. They do the games of, we're not gonna raise the debt ceiling, but in the end, they always raise the debt ceiling, because number one, they would like to keep their power, number two, it would be irresponsible not to.
That was the way our domestic discussion turned out, with
Yeah.
some zig and zags. But that's, it wasn't as clear that Greece was going to turn out that way.
Yeah, the monetary policy of the European Union is a whole other story. So I just wanted to put this as a base to understand how international capital flows work. As investors around the world seek the real rates of return around the world, based looking at the nominal rates, inflation rates, and the regime
But
uncertainty.
And to connect that,
Yeah.
is the point that international investors in bonds will move from currency to currency depending upon where they
A change in
find
these
that-
variables. Exactly.
find the best real rate of return.
Exactly. So let's look at that now. This is called the Fisher effects. Then now we're going to apply this to a different scenario, international Fisher effects. Sounds like you got that. The people next door are a little noisy. I don't know what's going on. So let's say that. Let's say that this is the USA and the rest of the world. Or the same logic applies to country A and country B. So, here, the real rate of return in country A will equal the real rate of return in country B. Let's say that inflation is expected to go, and let's call this, just for example, euros and dollars. So let's say that, as it is today, the European Union has higher expected inflation than the United States, right? So what will investors do? If the European Union has expected higher rates of inflation, that means that the real rate of return in Europe would be less than the expected real rate of return in the United States.
Unless they bid up the interest rate.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
And it'll be equal.
yeah, say,
Arguably equal.
yeah, but right now, because of the negative interest rate policy in Europe, it's expected that the real rate of return in Europe will be less for a given denominated bond with a given risk class. So people will sell euros and buy dollars until they equal. And because there's about $3 or $4 trillion every trading day traded, or what's that? When I was chief of financial oversight at the U.S. Department of State in 1990, in 2001, there was $1.5 trillion traded every day in the Forex market. Today there's about $4 trillion traded every day in the Forex market. And that's just called the financialization of the economy, a lot of which has to do with there's so much money printing recently, over the last 10 years, which has been less now. So then the way the capital flows flow around the world as people buy and sell different currencies based on expected rates of inflation, and expected regime uncertainty or rule of law uncertainty, right? Right. So, got that? Any questions on that?
Nope.
Yeah, yeah.
Sure.
Keep going. Okay, so that's how international capital flows work, which aren't real goods and services flows. Now we're going to look at the export minus import portion of the international capital flows, right? The international capital flows for world trade are about 10% of the economy, about 80 trillion, so about $8 trillion a year in capital flows related to real goods and services. So here, this is the current account. Current account, and this is the capital account. Capital account. The current account are real goods and services. And then the capital account are money flows. So by definition, when you aggregate worldwide trade, the capital account plus the current account nets to zero, right? When you add up all of the goods and services trades, all the money flows, add them up and it nets to zero.
Because the capital moves in the opposite direction
Yeah.
for the goods and services.
Exactly, right. So, yeah. So let's say that the United States is exporting to Europe. So here's the real goods and services flows. What the United States is exporting to Europe, and so the Europe would sell euros and buy dollars. So they're sending euros this way, and they're sending dollars this way. Right? So the real goods and services are paid for by selling euros, getting dollars to pay for the real goods and services.
Might the capital account be delinked from the current account, whereas in the previous example, there were market differences in inflation and the desirability of one currency or another,
Yeah.
so that there might be more capital transferred than, for investment purposes,
Yeah.
than equivalent to pay for goods and services.
Yes, there would, yeah. Right now we're only looking at this part. So,
We're not taking into consideration the previous slide
yeah.
where we're talking about equalizing real rates of return.
Yeah. The idea behind the real rates of return just was to give us an idea of how capital flows. But the topic of our topic is why it doesn't matter if the USA imports more than it exports. So what we're looking at is the international capital flows for exports and imports,
Okay.
not the secondary bond market or secondary equity market, which is 10 times this.
Mhm.
So that's a good question. Some people say there are imbalances in international capital flows, and that caused the financial crisis. But that's a little beyond what we're talking about today. Today we're just talking about exports and imports, as opposed to the secondary market capital flows. How are we doing on time?
We have 7 more minutes.
7 more minutes, okay. Okay, so now do this again. So the United States has continued to run trade deficits ever since the United States has continued to run trade deficits, importing more than exporting, ever since World War II. Now, the reason for that is because prior to World War I, England was the international reserve currency. The English Empire was the king or the queen, whatever it was. And the international reserve currency was the British pound. But ever since World War II, the United States dollar has been the international world reserve currency. So because we have been able to import more than we've exported, the reason for that is because people have been willing to hold dollars. So people have been willing to hold dollars because we've had a better monetary policy, right? Less inflation. We've had a better rule of law. So people have been willing to hold dollars. The Chinese, Hank Paulson at Goldman Sachs sold the Chinese central bank $3 trillion, 5 minutes left, $3 trillion worth of U.S. government bonds and mortgage-backed bonds guaranteed by the U.S. government. $3 trillion the Chinese central bank was willing to hold. It's less than that now. It's more like $1.5 trillion. India holds dollars in their central bank as international reserve currency. So what do they do with these dollars? What did Japan do with these dollars in the 80s? They bought golf courses and works of art. What do the Chinese do with the dollars? They send their children to college in the United States and they're buying Manhattan real estate, right? So as long as, the point is, as long as people will hold your currency, if you have a good rule of law and good monetary and fiscal policy, you can continue to run imports greater than exports as long as people are willing to hold your currency. It's only when people stop being willing to hold your currency that you run into a problem. That's the spiel of why it doesn't matter if the USA imports more than exports. So you got criticism.
Well, I have some questions for you. It really doesn't matter. So, I think, there's no difference whether you have a trade deficit or trade surplus. What's the harm in striving for surplus?
Okay.
All the time. Deficit doesn't hurt, but a surplus won't hurt either.
Okay.
What's the benefit of a deficit?
Well, in the first case, very good. What's the benefit of a deficit? In the first case, in the United States, we have this thing called the twin deficits. And this is something Donald Trump probably doesn't understand, is because people are willing to hold your dollars, and because you're importing more than you're exporting, that means a lot of these dollars goes to fund the U.S. government deficit. So if people aren't willing to hold your dollars, then there's no international capital flows. People aren't going to buy your government bonds, so you have to tighten the budget.
And is it a good thing or a bad thing to run a big government deficit?
It's a terrible thing.
So having a trade deficit is a bad thing because it enables you to do another bad thing, which is have a budget deficit.
Yeah. Now,
so a surplus would be better.
No, that's very good. So the problem when you start believing this, that this is a good thing, which is Keynesian economics, that's an excuse to, as you know, the United States continuously, off and on, continuously accuses China of holding down the value of their currency. Every year, the administration has to report to Congress who's manipulating their currency. And the reason why China would hold down their currency is to make their goods cheaper in the international market, so they can hold the People's Bank can hold dollars, so that the Chinese People's Military, whatever it's called, what's it called?
People's
So the People's Army can buy weapons on the international market with dollars. So when you start believing that it's better to export more than you import, that's when you start putting in trade barriers. And we did a show recently about trade barriers. The minute you start putting on trade barriers is when political leaders start choosing who gets protected. And that's cronyism. And so, for example, the trade barriers on steel and aluminum help the steel manufacturers but harm everyone else.
Well, let me put on the table the question of whether permitting, considering benign, a trade deficit with a trading partner like a China, which I will suggest doesn't play by Keynesian free market rules.
Okay.
It's a communist, totalitarian.
Very, very good. Very, very good. Let's stop there because we've just used up our 27 minutes.
Thank you to Cameron. We are unfortunately out of time at a critical moment, but we'll pick this up in the second half of the show. I'm Ron Lichman. Thanks for watching Hardfire.